Her voice came through the phone like a breeze that carried no warmth. "Dad, I need to ask something. Please don't be upset." I paused before answering. I already knew. There was a hesitation in her tone I hadn't heard since she was little, when she broke her mom's vase and tried to hide it behind the curtain. But this wasn't a broken vase. It was something else. Then she said it. "Please don't make a speech at the wedding." The words didn't land all at once. At first it sounded practical. Maybe there were time limits. Maybe too many speakers. Maybe it wasn't personal. But then came the second blow. "It's just, you don't really match the tone, the guests, the vibe. It's nothing bad. You're just, number I didn't know. Or maybe I did. But I wanted to hear her say it. You're more traditional. I don't want people to feel uncomfortable. It's a very curated event." Curated? Like a gallery? And I was the cracked frame she didn't want on the wall. I leaned against the counter, staring out the small kitchen window. Outside, the neighbor's kid was riding a bike, wobbling, laughing, falling, getting up again. I remembered teaching her the same way, running behind her on that faded blue bike, yelling, "Don't look back, just keep going." She did keep going. So far, in fact, she'd left me behind. I cleared my throat. "So you don't want me to speak at all? I mean, you can say hi to people, but no speeches." And she hesitated again. "If anyone asks, maybe just say you're a guest, like a family friend. That might be easier." I sat down, not because I was tired, because my knees went weak. She was ashamed of me. Not the suit I would wear, though I knew it wasn't designer. Not the gift I'd bring, though I knew it wouldn't be flashy. She was ashamed of me, my presence, my story, my life, the life I built for her. I didn't yell, I didn't protest, I didn't cry. I just said, "All right, sweetheart, if that makes things easier for you." "Thank you, Dad. I really appreciate you being understanding." Understanding. She had no idea what she was asking me to understand. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dim kitchen, the afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the floor. I looked at the calendar on the fridge. The wedding was circled in red. I had counted the days, not because I wanted a moment in the spotlight. I didn't care for speeches or attention. I just wanted to stand there proud, to say that's my daughter, to thank the people who came for loving her, to honor the journey that brought her here. But now she wanted me silent, invisible, unnamed. I reached for the box on the top shelf of the closet. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was the suit I wore to her high school graduation. A little snug now, the color faded. I had saved it for special days. And this was still a special day. Even if I would be seated at the back, even if my name would never be called. I pressed the lapel flat and set the suit aside. I'd go, I'd sit, I'd smile. But in that quiet moment, I promised myself something. I would not speak. Unless silence became heavier than shame, and if that moment came, she would remember why she once called me her hero. Friends, let me take a short pause. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? If this story touches you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. The box was still there, behind the winter blankets and the broken heater I never had the heart to throw out. Cardboard faded, one corner crushed, tape peeling at the edges. I hadn't opened it in years, not since she graduated. Inside was the suit, dark gray, slight shine from age. I lifted it carefully like it might tear, not the fabric, but the memories. Memories woven into every thread. This was the suit I wore the day I walked into her school, standing in front of the principal's desk with a trembling voice and steady hands. They had caught her with money from the cafeteria drawer, a dare she once confessed, and they were ready to expel her. But I stood there, in this very suit, and said, "Blame me. Say I failed her, but don't take her future away." And they didn't, because sometimes love doesn't raise its voice. It just refuses to leave. Now, years later, the same suit hung from my hands, slightly smaller on my shoulders, the weight of time stitched into the seams. I brushed off the dust, pressing the lapels flat with care. I couldn't afford a new one, but even if I could, this was the one that had stood with her, protected her, fought for her when no one else did. I held it up to my chest, standing in front of the mirror. The fit was tight. The sleeves pulled a little, but it would do. The suit had survived years in a box, and so had I. On the dresser sat an old cufflink, only one. The other had been lost at a job site years ago, swallowed in wet concrete. I kept this one out of stubbornness, maybe hope, like keeping half of something meant you weren't truly without. Beside it, a photo of us. She was 10, missing her front teeth, arms wrapped around my neck like I was her whole world. She had no shame then, only pride. I traced her face with my finger. She'd grown up, become polished, precise, someone who curated her life with careful hands and filtered smiles. And yet, I had been there for every unfiltered moment. When she cried over her first heartbreak, when she called me from the bus stop, too scared to walk home alone, when she whispered, "I'm not enough," and I told her she was more than enough. She was everything. Back then, my arms were her shelter. Now, I was the part of her she wanted to hide. I folded the suit over the hanger and placed it gently on the hook by the door. I would wear it, not to impress anyone, but because it carried the story she forgot to tell. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table, writing a note I didn't plan to give her. I needed to write it anyway, to remind myself. I wrote about the night I worked a double shift to buy her prom dress, about the night her mother left, and how I sat by her bed until morning so she wouldn't feel the silence alone, about how I never missed a parent-teacher conference, even if I came covered in drywall dust. I wrote it all down, because no one else would. I folded the letter and tucked it into the inside pocket of the suit, not to hand her, just to carry with me, like the cufflink, like the weight, like the memory of a father who showed up, even when no one asked him to. Especially then, outside the night was quiet. I turned off the light, and as the room dimmed, the suit stood by the door, waiting. Not for applause, not for attention, just for the next moment, where love would show up again, whether it was wanted or not. The church was quiet when I arrived. Rows of white chairs stood in perfect formation, dressed in pale ribbons and soft flowers. It looked like a dream, one she must have carried since childhood. I remembered her drawing something like this once, crayons and crooked hearts filling the page. I taped it to the fridge for years. Now that little girl was gone, replaced by this elegant woman moving through the aisle, focused, rehearsed, radiant, and distant. I stood near the back, unnoticed for a moment, just watching. She was laughing with the wedding planner, fixing her hair, adjusting the hem of her dress rehearsal gown. Her fiancé glanced over, gave a quick nod, then looked away. The kind of nod you give someone you're told you should acknowledge, but don't quite know what to say to. No one offered me a seat, so I stood. The coordinator called for positions. "Let's run it from the top. Nerves out, smiles on." Everyone took their places. The music started from a phone speaker, tinny and thin, but enough to paint the moment. Her mother stood beside her, beaming. Aunts, cousins, friends, all glowing like they belonged in a fairy tale. I stayed back, not sure when or if I was meant to join. Then the photographer arrived, clicking and giving instructions. "Let's get a few shots before we start. Bride with family, please." I took a small step forward, instinct more than intention. But she turned, not harshly, not loudly, just deliberately. "Just Mom for this one," she said without meeting my eyes. Then softer. "For show, not for me. Dad, can you wait over there for a bit?" "Over there." I looked where she pointed. The back pew, the shadows, the edge of the room. I nodded, didn't speak. Even if I had, I don't think my voice would have come out. I walked slowly past the rows of smiling guests, past the planner who didn't look up, past the groom's mother who gave me a sympathetic half-smile. The kind people give at funerals. I sat alone, and when the camera flashed, a moment that would live on walls and photo albums for decades, I was already outside the frame. I stared at the altar, the same altar where I imagined once, walking her down the aisle, giving her hand not as a prop, not as a placeholder, but as the man who had loved her first. But I wasn't a part of the picture. I wasn't a part of the plan. I was a name on the guest list, a polite nod, a quiet seat. When the rehearsal ended, the room filled with applause. People hugged, complimented, joked, the kind of warmth that wraps around a moment and holds it still. I stepped outside before she could see my eyes. The late sun brushed gold across the pavement. I leaned against the side of the church and let the laughter echo without me. I wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger would have meant I expected more. But this was colder. The quiet ache of knowing you've been replaced, not by someone better, but by no one at all. I closed my eyes, tried to remember the last time she reached for my hand without hesitation. It had been years, long before this dress, this ring, this curated life. Inside, the doors opened, and the guests spilled out. I stood tall, like I hadn't just been benched by my own blood. One of the ushers clapped me on the back. "Big day tomorrow, huh? You must be proud." I smiled. Pride and pain, I've learned, wear the same face when you're a father. After the rehearsal, people lingered in small clusters, laughing, sipping cheap wine poured into fancy plastic glasses, complimenting the flowers, the lighting, the aesthetic. I sat on a bench near the parking lot, the kind meant for decoration more than comfort. The sky was darkening, painted in quiet colors, but no one looked up. All eyes were on each other. They were her world now, perfectly dressed, perfectly filtered, perfectly hollow. I was folding my hands, trying not to fidget, when her aunt, my late wife's sister, approached and sat beside me. She hadn't said much during the rehearsal, just offered a distant nod when I arrived. But now she leaned in close, her voice soft. "Don't blame her," she whispered. "She's trying to make a good impression. These people, they're different." I nodded slowly, like I understood, but something in me resisted the idea. Different. Is that what we call people now when we mean richer? More polished? More able to look at a man's worn shoes and see failure instead of history? I stared at the scuff on my left shoe, the one from when I fell off the ladder while fixing her childhood bedroom ceiling. She had cried, thinking I'd broken something. I told her it was just paint and pride. We laughed for 10 minutes. That mark never came out. I kept the shoes anyway, they still fit. She wanted to impress these people. But what about the man who carried her sleeping body from car to bed for over a decade? The man who said no to overtime so he could be at every parent meeting? The man who once went hungry for 3 days just to afford her choir trip because she said it was everything? Was their opinion really worth more than all that? I sat with that question, heavy in my chest. The kind of weight you can't lift. You just learn to carry it. Around me, the voices grew louder. Someone laughed too hard. A woman nearby said, "I think her dad's a contractor or something." I'm not sure, no one introduced him. Her tone wasn't cruel, just indifferent. That was worse. They didn't know me, because she hadn't let them. I watched her from afar. She was radiant. That was the word. Not just beautiful, but radiant. Like someone who had carefully cultivated everything about herself for this moment. The right dress, the right hair, the right guest list. And I didn't belong in that frame. She looked over once, caught my gaze for half a second, then looked away, like the moment had never happened. I turned to her aunt. She was still sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap. "Do you remember," I asked, "when she fell from that swing and broke her arm?" Her eyes softened. She nodded. "I carried her to the car in the middle of a thunderstorm. She screamed the whole way. But when we got there, she wouldn't let the nurse take her until I kissed her forehead. She said that made the pain smaller." I paused. She used to believe I made the pain smaller. Now she didn't even want me in the photos. Her aunt reached out, placed a gentle hand on mine. People forget where they come from, especially when they're trying to prove they've arrived. I understood, I did. But understanding doesn't stop the sting. It just makes it quieter, deeper. I looked back at the church doors. She disappeared inside, laughing with someone I didn't know. Someone who, I assumed, knew her new world better than I ever would. I stood, brushing the dust off my jacket, and walked to my car. It was older than most of the ones in the lot, the kind that makes valets hesitate. But it ran. It had carried us to birthdays, holidays, hospital visits. It had held tears and arguments and apologies and long silences where love lived. Wordless but sure. I drove home with the windows down. The night air was sharp but honest. No curated lights, no filtered smiles. Just the road, the wind, and the hum of everything I once gave, now invisible. I told myself I would keep showing up, not for recognition, not for redemption, but because that's what fathers do. Even when the world forgets, we remember. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet for a night like this. Outside the window, the city pulsed with life. Laughter drifted up from the streets below. Headlights painted streaks across the walls, and music from a nearby rooftop bar hummed like the background noise of a life that no longer included me. I sat in the armchair by the window, suit hanging neatly on the door. I hadn't unpacked much, just the essentials. The room was tidy, impersonal, beige in both color and feeling. It could have belonged to anyone, and in a way, maybe that was fitting. On the nightstand, my phone buzzed with messages. See you tomorrow. Can't wait for the big day. Tell your daughter she's stunning. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I opened my photo gallery and scrolled. Not to yesterday, not to last year, but years back. Back when the pictures were a little blurry, the lighting always off, but the smiles were real, full, unfiltered. There she was, 7 years old, 2 front teeth missing, holding a handmade sign in her crayon-streaked fingers. My hero, my dad. She was wearing a cape made from an old towel. I was behind her in the picture, caught mid-laugh, arms out like wings. That day she made me a crown from foil and cereal box cardboard. She insisted I wear it while she told everyone at the family cookout that her daddy could fix anything, even the sky, if it ever broke. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred. She used to look at me with wonder. Now she barely looked at all. Somewhere between that picture and this hotel room, I had gone from hero to inconvenience, a relic from a life she was trying to outgrow. And maybe I had made that easy. I never chased her into her new world, never forced her to explain the distance. I thought love didn't need reminding. I thought showing up was enough. But I was learning something painful. Love can fade in silence, and sometimes the ones we protect forget who stood guard while they built their dreams. She used to run into my arms after school. Now she runs from the parts of herself that still sound like me. I looked around the room. Cold walls, sterile bedding, a minibar filled with overpriced distractions. It was nothing like home. But then again, home hadn't felt like home in a long time. Not since she stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped asking how I was. Tomorrow she would say her vows, pledge her forever to someone else. And I would be there, sitting quietly like a placeholder, not walking her down the aisle, not giving a speech, not even named in the program, probably. I wondered if her new family knew anything about me beyond what she'd curated. Did they know I taught her how to ride a bike in the rain because she insisted the street was less scary when it's wet? Did they know I stayed up all night helping her finish a science fair project after she forgot about it until the day before? Did they know I sewed her dance recital costume by hand because we couldn't afford a new one? And she cried when she saw it because she said it was perfect. No one would talk about that tomorrow. They'd speak of elegance, success, poise, things she'd earned, yes, but not alone. And yet, I wasn't angry. I was grieving a place I once held in her heart, grieving the little girl who once believed I could fix the sky. I set the phone down gently and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars, uncaring, unreachable. I thought of the letter in my suit pocket, the one I'd written and rewritten a dozen times. A letter she'd probably never read, a letter filled with things too heavy for a toast, too quiet for a crowd. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me. Tomorrow would come, with all its ceremony and spectacle, and I would be there, not to shine, not to speak, not to be seen, but to stand in the shadows. Because even when love is forgotten, it still shows up. The chapel was bathed in golden light, soft music weaving through the quiet rustle of satin and whispered greetings. It was the kind of morning photographers dream of. Sunlight slipping perfectly through stained glass, petals scattered like blessings, every detail rehearsed into effortless grace. I arrived early, sat where they told me to, end of the pew, back left side. They didn't say why, but I understood. It was far enough to keep me out of frame, close enough to say I was included. People filed in one by one, laughter rippled, dresses shimmered. There was excitement in the air, thick and bright, and I tried to breathe it in without choking on the truth of what I was about to witness. When the music changed, the room stilled, the doors opened, and then she entered. My daughter, my little girl, but not little anymore. She floated down the aisle like someone out of a painting, timeless, flawless, adored by all eyes around her. Every step seemed choreographed to perfection, every movement soft and slow, as if time itself had been asked to pause for her. And perhaps it had. She was radiant and somehow unreachable. I had imagined this moment differently once. In those early years, when she used to say she'd marry someone just like me, I thought I'd walk beside her. I thought she'd squeeze my arm as we moved down the aisle, eyes wide with both joy and fear, looking to me not just as the man giving her away, but as the one who taught her what love is supposed to feel like. But today she walked alone, because that was her choice. And maybe that said more than words ever could. She didn't glance in my direction. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on the man waiting at the altar, on the new life she'd chosen, on the world she had built without me. I watched her take her place, and I told myself to be proud, because I was. But pride feels different when you're forced to feel it from the sidelines. It doesn't glow. It tightens in your chest, like a hand clenching around something precious you're no longer allowed to hold. The ceremony began. Words were spoken, vows exchanged. She laughed lightly at something the officiant said. Her groom looked at her the way I once thought only a father could. Then came the moment for acknowledgments, the part where the bride thanks those who shaped her, those who made her who she is. And she spoke clearly, confidently to the crowd. I wouldn't be here without the incredible people who believed in me, who guided me, who helped me grow into the woman I am today. She looked at her mother, at her friends, at her mentor from college, at her fiancé's family. Each gaze was a soft spotlight, but when she paused, just long enough for my heart to rise, she moved on. No glance, no name, not even a shadow of acknowledgement. I sat still, not out of strength, but because I didn't know how else to hold myself together. You don't raise a child expecting thanks. But silence? Silence when love was loud and constant for years. That feels like a wound without blood. Quiet, invisible, but deep. I stared at my hands, the ones that once held hers across crowded streets, the ones that clapped loudest at school plays, the ones that built furniture late into the night for her first apartment. Now they rested in my lap, out of sight, folded like they were apologizing for existing. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the chapel. People rose. They cried. They cheered. The newlyweds kissed beneath an arch of roses while cameras flashed like tiny fireworks. It was a perfect moment, but perfect doesn't mean complete. I stood with the others, smiled politely, clapped with the same hands that once carried her through fevers and nightmares and growing pains. And as they walked back up the aisle, arm in arm, I remained still. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The little girl who once called me her world had built a new one, and I was no longer in orbit. But I stayed, because fathers don't vanish, even when they're forgotten. Even when the last thank you goes to someone else. We stay, because that's what love does when pride would rather walk away. The reception hall shimmered. Strings of warm lights hung from the rafters, like stars arranged by hand. Each table was a vision, centerpieces of white roses and gold-dipped leaves, name cards in cursive print, glasses already filled with champagne. Every detail whispered perfection. I found my name at the far table by the speakers, not quite tucked in the corner, but far enough to be safely forgotten. I smiled and sat down, careful not to wrinkle the suit that suddenly felt heavier on my shoulders. Laughter danced around the room. Waiters floated by like ghosts, offering hors d'oeuvres with words I couldn't pronounce. A jazz trio played something soft and unintrusive. And above it all, a voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin tonight's celebration, we have a few special people who will be giving toasts. People who've helped shape this incredible journey. The MC beamed as polite applause rippled across the room. First, the bride's mother, a pillar of grace and strength. She rose with ease. Dressed in elegance, she took the microphone and spoke of motherhood, of challenges overcome, of dreams watched from the front row. She didn't mention me. She didn't need to. Her story had already erased mine. Next, the bride's college roommate, her best friend since freshman year. Another speech, more laughter, more tears. Then the groom's boss, a man with sharp eyes and expensive confidence, toasted their ambition, their future, their polished brilliance. Power couple, he said, destined for impact. I sipped my water. My glass trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from something deeper. something that doesn't show on the surface, like a crack beneath the paint. The list continued. Names were called, each with reverence. Colleagues, mentors, friends of the family. People who knew fragments of her life, curated glimpses. And me? The man who knew her as a whole story, beginning to now, wasn't mentioned. At my table, a man I didn't recognize leaned toward me. Older, kind face. "Forgive me," he said softly. "Oh, aren't you her father?" I nodded, offering a gentle smile that ached behind the skin. "I am." He frowned. "Strange. I expected you'd be one of the first to speak." I looked at my napkin, smoothed the edges. She asked me not to. His face changed. That quiet, uncomfortable surprise people wear when they've stumbled into something too personal. He patted my arm, unsure of what to say. "Still," he murmured, "seems wrong. You belong up there." I didn't answer. What could I say? That I'd rehearsed words in my head every night for a month? That I bought this suit with money I didn't have just to stand proud beside her? That all I ever wanted, was to tell her, one last time, how much she changed me. Not through glamour or degrees or wedding invitations, but through scraped knees and sleepless nights, through small hands that trusted mine to carry the world. The speeches ended with cheers and clinking glasses. She and her new husband stood, arms wrapped like they were made to fit. Cameras flashed. Love poured in from every direction. I clapped too, not out of habit but out of choice. Because sometimes love claps when it's been pushed outside the room. Sometimes it stands when it hasn't been invited to speak. And sometimes it smiles, not because it feels joy, but because it refuses to let sorrow be seen by those who would never understand its weight. I sat in silence, surrounded by celebration. No one noticed. No one needed to. But I did, because I remembered everything they forgot to say. I needed a moment away from the noise. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses. It all began to blur together, a wave of sounds I no longer felt part of. The celebration was moving forward like a train I had been left watching from the platform. I slipped out into the hallway. Cool air, softer lighting, silence finally, like breath after drowning. The walls were lined with photographs, stylized portraits of the bride and groom, laughing in vineyards, holding hands at the coast, black and white shots that screamed timeless elegance. I stared at one in particular, her face lit up in mid-laugh, framed like a magazine cover. She looked happy, and impossibly far away. Down the corridor, a pair of voices carried around the corner, light-hearted, giddy. I didn't mean to listen, not at first. But then I heard my name, not directly, but the shape of me, carved into words that didn't know I was standing just feet away. "She just didn't want him to ruin the mood," one voice said, a woman's. Another voice followed, my daughter's. "It's not that I don't love him," she said. "It's just, his simplicity, the way he talks. It doesn't fit this setting. This is all so refined. He wouldn't get it. It's not his style. I just didn't want people to feel awkward." I froze. I had heard many things in my life. Words said in anger, in grief, even in betrayal. But this was different. This wasn't pain. This was shame. Not hers, mine. Shame, not for something I'd done, but for who I was. For the very fabric of me. The way I spoke, the life I lived, the humble skin I wore without apology. I stepped back, letting the shadows hold me like an old friend. They didn't know I was there, and maybe that was fitting. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be. I leaned against the wall, chest hollowed out by something heavier than heartbreak. Because there's a grief that comes when you lose someone, and there's a deeper grief when they're still alive, but you're no longer allowed to exist inside their story. I remembered her small hands in mine, sticky with popsicle juice, gripping tightly when she was afraid of thunderstorms. I remembered her bedtime voice whispering, "Tell me the story of when I was born." She used to cling to me. Now she edited me. I was no longer part of the version of her that she wanted to present to the world. I wanted to be angry, but what rose instead was sorrow. The kind that doesn't burn, it sinks. Quiet, heavy, it anchors to your ribs and waits. I looked at my shoes again. Same scuff, same wear. The shoes I wore the day she graduated. The day I sold my truck just so she wouldn't miss prom. The day I held her mother's hand and promised I'd raise our daughter to be strong and kind and proud of where she came from. I never imagined she'd be proud of everything but that. There's a moment in every parent's life when they realize their child has become their own person. It's natural, it's expected. But nothing prepares you for the moment when they decide you don't fit anymore. Not because you failed, but because you remind them of the parts they've worked hard to bury. I returned to the reception without a sound. My chair waited, untouched. My plate half full, now cold. People cheered for the next dance, for the next toast, for the next curated moment of perfection. And I sat quietly like I had promised, because that's what she asked of me, to be present but unseen. But somewhere inside me, something was breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cracking, because there's only so much silence a soul can carry before it begins to speak on its own. The night wore on like a slow unraveling. Laughter rose and fell around me. Plates clinked. Another round of toasts filled the air. But at my table, silence held its own kind of weight. Not heavy like grief, but fragile, like something one gust away from shattering. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and felt the paper, folded in thirds, unremarkable at a glance, but sacred in its contents. I hadn't meant to bring it. I had written it early that morning when sleep refused to come, and the city outside my window blinked with a million lives that weren't mine. At first, I just needed to write it to no one, to clear the clutter in my chest, to bleed in ink where words had long since dried up between us. But as my fingers touched the worn crease now, I knew I had written it to her. Whether she would ever read it or not, that part didn't matter. Some truths just demand to be spoken, even if only to the paper that holds them. The letter was simple, but inside it, everything. I wrote about the night she was born, how the nurse handed her to me, wrapped like something too small and too holy to exist in this world, how I looked into her face and felt the terrifying beauty of responsibility, the kind that anchors your soul and refuses to let go. I wrote about the nights she had fevers that wouldn't break, how I sat on the floor by her bed, forehead resting on her mattress, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening, just to take the sickness away from her and give it to me. I wrote about the prom dress, how she cried when she saw it in the store window, and how I sold the last piece of her mother, the wedding ring I had hidden in my drawer for years, to buy it. She never knew. She thought it was a gift from the store's spring clearance. I wrote about how I took pictures of her sleeping after her first heartbreak, because I needed to remember that even in pain, she was still whole. I wrote about her voice, how she used to sing in the back seat of the car, off-key and loud, inventing lyrics that made no sense, and how I still hear those songs when I drive alone now. I wrote about how proud I was the day she graduated, not because of the degree, but because I knew how many nights she had cried, doubted herself, wanted to quit, and didn't. I stood at the back of the crowd that day too, but my chest was full, like I'd just won the world. And then I wrote the part that hurt to write. I told her I knew I didn't fit her life anymore, that the man I was, the one who scraped by, who wore old shoes, who never learned to speak like her polished world, didn't match the image she needed now. But I also told her something else, that I never showed up to be seen. I showed up to see her, to witness the woman I helped build, brick by quiet brick. And even if I stood in shadows for the rest of my life, I would never stop watching her shine. Because that's what fathers do. We love even when we're not invited to love out loud. I read it once more to myself there at the table, in that buzzing room full of voices that didn't know mine. The words blurred slightly, not from ink, but from the burn behind my eyes I refused to let fall. I folded the letter gently, ran my thumb across the crease. I thought maybe I'd slip it into her gift box, or maybe leave it in the room she'd stay in that night. But I knew I wouldn't. Not tonight. This letter was for the part of her that still remembered me. For the little girl with scraped knees and wide eyes who used to say, "Tell me a story, Daddy, but make it a true one." And this letter was the truest story I'd ever written. The story of a father who gave everything and asked only to be remembered. The music had softened. Dessert had been served. Glasses clinked less now, not from fatigue, but from fullness, of stomachs, of celebration, of spectacle. The lights dimmed ever so slightly as the MC stepped forward again, smiling with that kind of polished joy that never cracks. "Before we move to the dance floor," he said, Let's open the floor to any final words. If anyone close to the bride or groom would like to say something, now is the moment. The room stirred. Laughter. A few guests leaned forward, perhaps with something to say, a memory to share, but no one moved. And then, from a corner table across the room, a man's voice rose. Older, strong, clear. Has the bride's father spoken yet? It wasn't a challenge, just a question. A human one. Curious, maybe even kind. The room stilled. You could feel the silence settle like snow on shoulders. All heads turned. Slowly, as if coordinated by breath. My hands were still folded on my lap. The letter rested inside my jacket. My throat tightened, not from nerves, but from something older, like my body already knew not to hope too quickly. Then I saw her. She stood, gently but with purpose, and her voice, light but unmistakable, met the question before I could even rise. "He's fine," she said. "No need. He's tired. It's been a long day for him." Her tone was sweet enough to sound thoughtful, sweet enough to disarm anyone unfamiliar with its edge, but not sweet enough to reach me. The way she said it wasn't cruelty. That might have been easier to carry. It was dismissal, gentle, practiced, precise. And in that moment, she wasn't just keeping me from the microphone. She was pulling the curtain closed, quietly, finally, as if to say, "This chapter's over. He doesn't belong in the next one." I should have stayed seated. That would have been easier. But then the applause began, from another table, then another, small at first, then swelling. Not for me, not yet, but for the idea of me, the idea that perhaps a father should be allowed to speak. I caught the MC's glance. He looked uncertain, then hopeful. Someone behind me murmured, "Let him say something." Another, "It's his daughter's wedding." And suddenly I was rising, slowly, unsteadily, but rising. Her eyes met mine across the room, for a fraction of a second. Not anger, not hatred, but panic. Not because she feared what I'd say, but because she feared who I still was. The man she had tried to shrink, to polish, to silence, and who now refused to stay seated. I stepped forward, hands trembling slightly, not from fear of words, but from the weight of years unspoken. The room opened like a sea. Guests made space without asking. The microphone was offered to me, a small object, suddenly heavy in my palm. And as I stood in front of them, in front of her, I didn't feel power. I didn't feel victory. I felt ache, because I shouldn't have had to ask for this moment. It should have been given. But still I stood. Not for applause, not for redemption, not even for her. I stood for the father who sold a ring to buy a dress, for the man who read bedtime stories when his own eyes were red from exhaustion, for the voice that had been quiet long enough. And in that silence before I spoke, the only sound that filled the room was the beating of a heart that had waited too long to be heard. It felt longer than it was, that walk, from my table to the center of the room, 10, maybe 12 steps. But every inch was heavy, filled with years I hadn't spoken aloud. Chairs scraped the floor as people shifted to watch. Some smiled, some looked curious, others just respectful. But I didn't see them. I only saw her. My daughter stood near the head table, frozen. One hand clutched the edge of her seat. Her lips pressed together in that familiar way, the same look she wore when she was 7 and got caught lying about breaking a vase. But this wasn't guilt. It was fear. Not of what I might say, but of me, of my presence, my truth, my story, of the man she had tried to wrap in silence. But I didn't come to ruin anything. I didn't come to shame her. I came to remember and to remind. I came because love without a voice becomes a ghost, and I refused to haunt her quietly for the rest of my life. The microphone was already on. It gave a low hum as I approached, like it too was uncertain whether I belonged. I paused before touching it, just stood there for a moment, breathing, letting the silence settle around me. I thought of the early mornings, the ones where I woke before dawn just to make her lunch, because she liked it when I cut the sandwich into little stars. I thought of the time she came home crying because a classmate called her poor, and how I told her that kindness was the only real wealth. I thought of how she once told me she wanted to marry someone exactly like you, Daddy, and how I believed that would never change. I looked at her now, her perfect dress, her polished smile, her carefully built world, and I realized she hadn't erased me out of cruelty. She had done it out of survival, She thought my presence would unravel the illusion, that my calloused hands and second-hand suit would remind everyone where she came from, that my love, in its raw and unpolished form, was somehow too much for the room she had finally been accepted into. But I wasn't there to break the glass. I was there to speak from behind it. I placed my hands on the edge of the podium, grounding myself, and in the quiet before my first word I felt everything. Her fear, my sadness, the expectations in the room, and the heartbeat of a father who had been silent too long. Not for applause, not for pity, but for the truth. I wasn't there to steal the spotlight. I was there to remind her, and maybe myself, that before the dresses and toasts and carefully staged perfection, before the curated smiles and rewritten histories, there was a little girl who once believed I could fix anything, and maybe I still could. Not with silence, but with one last story, told from the only place that ever mattered, the heart of a father who never stopped, standing for her. I don't remember exactly how I began. Not the first sentence, not the tone, not even the breath that brought the words to life. I just remember the silence, a thick listening silence, the kind that fills a room not because it's empty, but because every soul in it has stopped moving, stopped chewing, stopped whispering, stopped judging. They listened, and I spoke. Not loud, not theatrical, but with the kind of calm that only comes from carrying a story inside your chest for too long. I told them I wasn't a poet, that I didn't have degrees or titles or curated words, that most of my speeches had been whispered in hallways at midnight, or yelled across soccer fields, or mumbled through the crack in a bedroom door just to say, "It's okay, I'm still here." I said, "I'm not a guest here. I'm the reason she exists, not just in body, but in the way she loves, in the way she stands, in the way she keeps going." Eyes widened. Some teared. I didn't look at her yet. I wasn't ready. I told them about soup made from water and salt when the fridge was empty, about shoes patched more times than I could count, because her school needed clean ones and mine could wait, about skipping dinners so she could have lunch, about selling the last thing her mother ever gave me just so she could wear something special to prom. I told them I was the man who turned off the lights in our home early, not because we were eco-conscious, but because the bill was already overdue. And I told them she never knew. Because a parent's job isn't to make their child aware of the weight. It's to lift it quietly so they can run farther. Then I paused, and only then did I lift my eyes to meet hers. She was frozen, not in shame, not in anger, but in something else, something softer, something cracking. I said, "She is elegant." Yes, brilliant, ambitious, polished. But those things didn't start in universities or internships or dinner parties. They started in the dark, in the quiet, in a 2-room apartment with leaky windows, and a father who would have burned the world just to keep her warm. I let the words settle. Then I said what I had never said before, what maybe I should have said years ago. I know I don't fit the frame anymore. I know the way I speak, the way I dress, the way I sit quietly in rooms like this. It isn't what people expect, but I will never apologize for being simple, because simple doesn't mean small. I breathed in, shallow but steady. I am the roots, and no tree grows without them. You may not see us, you may not name us, but everything you admire above the surface, it only exists because something held it below. And finally, my voice lower now, almost trembling, I said, "If anyone here believes simplicity is something to be ashamed of, I invite you to try and grow love, on hard floors under flickering lights, with empty pockets and aching hands. If you can grow a child into a woman like this, then maybe you'll understand. Pride doesn't need polish. It just needs truth." I stepped back. No mic drop, no dramatic exit, just silence. Thick, tender, real. Her eyes were full, hands pressed to her mouth, like she'd forgotten how to breathe. The groom had gone still beside her. Even the MC had lowered his head. I turned to walk back, not as a man who needed validation, but as a father who finally told the truth, not for their applause, but for her memory, so that somewhere in the years ahead, when the world starts to feel too loud, too fast, too curated, she might remember this moment, and remember what love looks like when it no longer asks to be invited. It simply stands. When I stepped back from the microphone, I didn't hear applause. Not at first. There was no clapping, no loud cheering, no hurried thank you from the host. There was only stillness and breath. The kind of breath that fills a room not through excitement, but through something deeper. Reverence, maybe, or recognition. The kind of breath that trembles quietly in people's chests when they've just heard something that makes them remember their own father, or the father they never had, or the one they wish they had been. I stood there unsure if I should walk away, not from the mic, but from the weight that had lifted, like something had been passed from my chest into the air, and now it belonged to everyone. In the corner of my eye, I saw her mother. She was dabbing her cheek with a napkin, lips pressed tight, her expression caught somewhere between pride and regret. We hadn't spoken in years, not truly, but in that moment I think we both understood that what was said had needed saying for a long time. The groom was staring at his lap, fingers steepled, still, not angry, just shaken, like something had shifted the ground beneath him, a new truth introduced into the foundation of his brand new life, a truth that couldn't be unseen. Maybe for the first time he was beginning to understand who stood behind the woman he had just married, not just figuratively, but literally, who had carried her unseen for years. And her, my daughter, she didn't move at first. Her hands were still where they'd been, one on her glass, one resting gently on the tablecloth, like she needed the fabric to anchor her. Her face was unreadable, not because it was blank, but because it held too much. I could see it, the tear that hadn't yet fallen, the tightness around her mouth, trying to hold in all the things she suddenly didn't know how to say, the gaze that wanted to look at me, needed to, but couldn't, not yet. And then slowly, she stood, not quickly, not theatrically. She rose like someone waking from a long dream, or a long silence. Her chair made the faintest scrape against the floor, and even that sound felt holy. People turned, all eyes on her now. She didn't speak. She didn't have to, because the way she looked at me, broken and full at the same time, was louder than any speech she could have given. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not guilt, not pity. Recognition. She saw me, not as a background figure, not as an inconvenience in her curated life, but as the man who built it from nothing. She pressed a hand to her chest, not dramatically, just instinctively, like she needed to keep her heart from splitting open. And then she took one small step toward me. I thought of all the times I had taken steps toward her. First steps, tiny shoes, wobbly legs. Steps into classrooms she was afraid to enter. Steps into arguments I didn't want to have, but had to. Steps into forgiveness. Steps into letting go. But this step, hers, was something else entirely. This one was toward coming home. Still no one clapped. The room didn't erupt, because they knew. They knew applause would have broken the moment. Some things aren't meant to be celebrated. Some things are meant to be held, in reverence, in silence, in the space between a father's voice finally heard and a daughter's heart finally remembering who taught it how to feel. She stood there just a few steps away from me, and for a long moment she didn't move. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, unsure of what to do, as if they no longer remembered how to reach for me, as if too many years of distance had rusted something once so natural. And then she walked, one step, then another, each one unsteady, not because the heels were high, but because truth weighs differently when it finally surfaces. When she reached me, she stopped. Her face, painted with perfect makeup hours earlier, had softened now. The edges had melted, not from heat, but from emotion. Her eyes, no longer wide with panic or pride, were raw, human. She opened her mouth to speak. "Dad," that was all she got out before her voice broke. And in that crack, that small, trembling fracture, I heard the little girl I hadn't seen in years. She looked at me like someone just beginning to understand the depth of what they'd been standing on all along. Like someone who had climbed so high she forgot there was someone, holding the base steady all this time. Her next words were barely audible. "I forgot," she whispered, "that pride isn't in the clothes we wear. It's in the people who never took theirs off, even when they were worn thin, who stood when everyone else sat, who stayed, even when they weren't wanted." Her shoulders fell, not from defeat, but from release. And then, without another word, she reached forward and wrapped her arms around me, not for the crowd, not for the photos, not for redemption, just because in that moment she needed to. It wasn't the kind of hug you give out of obligation. It was the kind that reaches backward, through childhood, through silence, through every unanswered message and missed birthday, and gathers it all into one sacred touch. I didn't hug her back at first, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't move. My body was remembering her as a child again, the way she used to cling to my shirt, her tiny fingers curling into the fabric like they were anchoring themselves. That memory crashed into this one, this grown woman shaking slightly in my arms, no longer too proud to fall into me. And finally I closed my arms around her, firm, not for show, but because I knew she needed to be held not as the bride she had become, but as the daughter she had always been. And then, only then, the room erupted. Applause. Not the forced kind, not the polite kind, but the kind that rises from something deeper than approval. The kind that says, "We saw what you did, and we see you now." Even the MC wiped his eyes. The groom looked down, overwhelmed, unsure whether to stand or sit or simply breathe. And still she held me, like she had just remembered something sacred, not something she had lost, but something that had never left. There, in the middle of chandeliers and centerpieces, her carefully curated world crumbled, and in its place something real stood tall. Not a filtered image, not a rehearsed version, but the unshakable truth that the finest thing she had ever worn was the quiet strength of a father who never stopped being proud of her, even when she forgot to be proud of him. A month passed, quietly, no grand gestures, no sudden transformation. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, the kind only a father knows, where the phone doesn't ring unless something breaks, and the mailbox holds more bills than words. The wedding had come and gone. Like a tide that swells, crashes, and recedes, it left behind only fragments, memories that still pulsed in my chest when the house got too quiet. I didn't expect anything more. The letter I'd carried in my suit pocket remained unread. I never gave it to her, never planned to. It sat now in the top drawer of my nightstand, beside old photographs, a faded ribbon from her third-grade science fair, and the crumpled drawing of me in a cardboard crown labeled Super Dad. I thought the story had ended there, with a hug, a tear, and the kind of moment people talk about over coffee but forget by the end of the year. But then a package arrived, no note on the front, just my name written in her hand, that same looping script she used when she was a child and signed birthday cards with too many hearts. I opened it slowly, carefully, as if it might break. Inside was a wooden picture frame, simple, no gold, no ornament, no glitter, just wood, warm, strong, real. And inside it, the photograph. Not one of the stage portraits, not one of the edited shots that had been posted all over her social media. It was the moment, our moment, captured quietly, perfectly. She had her arms wrapped around me, face buried in my shoulder. I stood still, eyes closed, holding her like I was holding the last warm thing in the world. We were not posing. We were not polished. We were real. I turned the frame over. On the back, written in her handwriting, was a message. The most important guest. The most honest image. My dad. I sat down. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just stared at the photo, my hand tracing the edge of the frame, and let the silence speak louder than any applause ever had. Because some recognition doesn't need an audience. Some love doesn't need to be performed. This was for me. It was her way of telling me that the speech she couldn't give, the words she hadn't known how to say, had finally found their way home. Not through microphones, not through toasts, but through this small wooden frame and the fire it lit in me. A fire not of pride, but of peace. The kind of peace that comes when the child you raised finally sees the road you built beneath her. Not because someone pointed it out, but because her own feet at last recognized the ground. I placed the frame on my mantel, right next to the only other photo I've kept there for decades. Her mother, laughing in the sun, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Now they were side by side, the beginning and the becoming. Later that night, I stood by the window with a cup of tea. No music, no noise, Just the sound of wind in the trees and the warmth of something whole settling inside me. Not everything we give returns when we want it to. Not every seed blooms in the season we expect. But sometimes, when the soil is right and the soul is ready, even the love you thought had been buried rises, not to make a scene, but to whisper, I saw you, I remember, and I am who I am, because you stood when no one else did. And some speeches I finally understood don't echo through rooms, they live in the quiet, burning slow, burning deep, in the hearts, that one day, finally, listen,